Major funding for Florida Matters comes from the Mosaic Company, a leading producer of fertilizer made from phosphate, a natural resource found in Florida. America's farmers depend on Florida phosphate for their crop nutrition needs. Mosaic, helping America grow.
If we tear everything down and we make our city and our state look like every other place, then there's nothing special about us anymore. So much of what's important about our place is the place itself, the built environment. And the more we lose that, the more we become like anywhere USA.
Today, we're talking about historic preservation through architecture, the buildings that create the landscape of our region's identity. Now, more than ever, there's an awareness of preserving the past and an urgency to protect the last remnants of a bygone era. Welcome to Florida Matters. I'm Irene Mayer. Preserving the past gives us a taste of nostalgia and provides a great tool for future generations to learn about the ways of life in earlier times. Many cities around the country are known for their historical significance and take great pride in their buildings that fill our history books. Today, we're taking a look at buildings that have been preserved and are fully functional with daily activities. The Ringling Museum in Sarasota has one of the largest collections of Italian Baroque art in the country. John and Mabel Ringling were passionate about the arts and even set aside a large endowment to preserve different forms of art. That's how the Oslo Theatre found its home on the Ringling estate. It's a story of monarchs, Mussolini, and music. It's the birthplace of Sarasota's art scene.
The Oslo Repertory Theatre began here 50 years ago. Eventually outgrew the space. The Sarasota Opera Company began in this tiny little theater. La Musica International Chamber Music Festival had its beginnings here. The ballet had its beginnings here.
This theater is so important because it created a demand for the performing arts in this region. So many of the great cultural venues in Sarasota started in the Asolo Theatre, and then through their great success grew out of the limited space and found the need to build their own performing arts halls. And so it's one of the reasons there's so many theaters around here.
The Oslo Theatre's design is as much of a draw as the performances held on its stage.
It was once said that this is one of two theaters in North America that's worth the price of admission merely to buy a ticket and be seated.
How the Italian theater became a Sarasota landmark is part of the intrigue.
The Oslo Theatre it dates from the 18th century. It was built in a castle in Oslo, Italy, to honor Queen Caterina, whose portrait is here. At that time in Europe, there were a number, particularly in Italy, small palace theaters such as this. But in the 1930s, Mussolini's government determined that this particular theater was sort of an artifact from a bygone era, and it was removed to make way for a film theater. It was then, it came into the possession of an antiquarian dealer who then sold it to the first director of the Ringling Museum of Art, primarily because it speaks very directly to our collection of Italian Baroque art.
The Oslo Theatre settled into its second home during the 1950s, but after 40 years of performances here in Florida, the theater began to show its age and was closed to the public for extensive renovations in the late 1990s.
What you see here now, everything that's gold now was pretty much black. Everything that was green, if you can imagine, there was a time people were allowed to smoke in theaters. So the place was covered with tobacco smoke. Much of the ornamentation had been lost. Things were damaged. There were great cracks in all the portraits. Down Caterina's face, there was a crack about a half-inch wide. It was in a building that leaked. The piece up above here, the proscenium, is only paper thin because of termites.
While restoring the Oslo Theatre to its former glory, museum curators also uncovered new parts of the theatre's design.
The architect was Francesco De Marchi, And the Asolo brothers, we found the faces of two of these gentlemen in pencil behind one of the decorative elements. So in lieu of a signature, their faces, we think, may have been their explanation that they were the ones that did this beautiful work.
It took nearly a decade for the entire process to be completed.
Everything you see here was taken apart, cataloged, stored, fumigated, debugged, and then for another full year it was brought in piece by piece by piece into our conservation labs, where it was restored, repaired.
I think it was a sense of humility, passion, and a learning process. None of them were the same. There were different structural breakage situations. There were needs for back building to keep them integral.
But the end result continues to be a source of pride for everyone involved in the restoration.
And we looked at it and we said, it really looks nice, doesn't it? But then it was when other people started to come into the theater, and we would bring them on the stage like where we are now, and we would close the curtain, wouldn't let them see it, and then open the curtain and you'd hear them go, "Oh my God." And we've never gotten tired of hearing people say that.
The joy of the last 10 years is to be able to bring back to life facilities that had really lay dormant because of neglect. And when we clean the panels of the theater, to uncover the glories of the painting beneath and the gilding and the treasure is really like bringing something back to life.
Since the Oslo Theatre reopened in 2006, it has enjoyed a full calendar of events.
The theater is very active. There are close to 200 to 300 performances a year. We do a full schedule of theater, music, dance, film, lectures.
And museum curators recognize the restoration process is an ongoing endeavor.
It's an old piece, so the cracks are starting to reappear, and gilding needs to be touched up every year, and just very careful cleaning. But it doesn't get nearly the same, I don't want to say abuse, but that it used to get. We're in a climate-controlled building now. People are not smoking in here, so it should last longer this time than it did last.
Visitors and performers alike can rest assured the curtain will not be closing anytime soon.
And at this point, we are doing our most diligent best to make sure that that theater is well maintained year after year, and a portion of our ticket sales we redirect to care for the facility and to keep it in a manner that people can be proud of, not only now but in decades to come.
When it comes to star power, the Polk Theatre drew in many celebrities during its heyday. Elvis Presley, Gene Krupa, Annie Arnold, and Gene Autry were just some of the famous faces that graced the stage. The theater has been preserved throughout the years, and its story will give you some idea about what it takes to save a building. The Polk Theatre in Lakeland opened its doors on December 22, 1928. More than 2,000 people attended and were amazed at what they discovered. As they walked inside, they were magically transported to a Mediterranean village inspired by an Italian Renaissance design. Special effects allowed the audience to view a sunset over the Italian piazza and then to look up and see a star-filled night sky. A cloud even rolled in overhead. This was something grand and wonderful for Lakeland, a vaudeville stage and movie palace. From that moment forward, the Polk Theatre has been creating fond memories.
I can just remember what they used to call the serials back then, you know, the Western serials. I can always remember the movie tone news would always come on prior to the main picture. You could get into the theater for 9 cents, and you could buy a nickel candy bar, a nickel Coke, and that was a full Saturday.
Among the great acts that came to the Polk, Sally Rand, Tommy Dorsey, Harry James, and Judy Garland. And when rock and roll came to town, Elvis Presley. He stole many a Lakeland girl's heart that night on stage and left his signature on the dressing room wall. The theater survived the rigors of the Great Depression and World War II. It provided an escape from the hardships of the times and the heat of the day.
They used to come here in the 20s and 30s to get cool, because air conditioning was unheard of in Lakeland, Florida at that time, in most places as a matter of fact. And this was the coolest place in town, and in fact they would say that when they turned the air conditioner on here, that the whole city lighting, the street lights would dim because of the power draw.
The theater's heyday was in the 30s and the 40s, but something new came along in the 50s that threatened its existence: television.
The theater company decided that because of television and its effect on movie-going, that they needed to do some drastic things that would increase their revenues. And what they did was to build a wall at the back of the theater so that they could have a lobby that was devoted to concessions in a big way. And they had no respect at all for the fabric of the theater itself. But what they did was probably responsible for saving the theater from an even worse fate, because it kept the theater profitable for another 20 years.
As time went on, new theaters were built in the suburbs with multiple screens. No one came downtown anymore, and the beauty of the Polk began to fade and crumble.
The Plitt Theater Company was the owner at that time, and they had decided that it just was not profitable enough to keep going. And when some local people caught wind of this, they realized that this theater, this building, might be in jeopardy, and it was too important to the community to take a chance of losing it, and they formed a group called Polk County Landmarks Incorporated.
The group secured a loan and bought the theater with one goal: to bring it back to its original glory. After applying for the theater to be added to the National Registry of Historic Places, it was time to find funding for the restoration.
We had to convince the community, everybody that we were going to approach, to believe in our vision.
Polk County Landmarks received a wide range of support, and restoration began with special care given to every detail.
That included new carpeting, of course, painting. We had scaffolding behind me that reached all the way to the ceiling, which I suspect is probably 40 or 50 feet high.
The old seats were taken out and replaced with newer, more comfortable chairs. The old marquee was replicated and put into place. Today, the theater is back to its original beauty for all to enjoy. It's been given a new life and future.
The Polk Theatre happens to be one of only 3 other atmospheric theaters in the state of Florida. The Tampa Theatre is also one. Joining us in the studio today is Dr. Elizabeth Strom, Director of the Urban and Regional Planning Program at USF, as well as Dr. Vikas Mehta from the School of Architecture and Community Design at USF. Thank you both for joining us today. We're going to begin by talking about something we heard about earlier in the show. Rodney Kite Powell with the Tampa History Center was mentioning the idea of historic preservation adding to a city's identity, helping to define a city. How does that happen? How does that work?
Well, I think when you think about cities that you might want to visit or cities that are remarkable in some way, it's usually for some either iconic kind of building like the Sydney Opera House, or for some very distinctive sort of neighborhood, New York City's Village, for instance. And I think that the identity of the city is in some ways embodied in these buildings and the feel of the neighborhood that people associate with that city. These are not generic sorts of buildings or neighborhoods. This is not the big box store that you can find anywhere. These are things that are a part of the emotional life of the city and the civic spirit of the city.
Mm-hmm. How does the city then, for example, say this is Tampa or this is St. Pete?
And as Dr. Strom said, it's also the cultural life of the city. So if you think about the history of a city in terms of a narrative, right? We talk about history of a place or an object through books, stories, all of that. The environment with historic sort of preserved buildings brings this to life. So that narrative is very well then displayed in the landscape. And that's really important from a cultural perspective.
Sure. Now, preserving a building or a landmark can be a complicated process. It can be time consuming and it can be expensive. So why even bother?
Well, I think first of all, although there can be expenses involved, I know that there are federal and state programs that help people maintain historic buildings. But I also want to point out that there's all kinds of research showing that historic designations actually increase property values. And so when a neighborhood is designated historic, there are studies from Texas, New York, virtually every city that suggest that there's actually some kind of an upside for owners. If they make that initial investment, they see benefits down the road.
Of course, there are other advantages of historic buildings in terms of if you were to look at their sustainability aspects in terms of their design. These buildings were predominantly constructed before we had air conditioning. So we're looking at buildings that have been made, even the most ordinary buildings, even warehouses or buildings where people were, industrial buildings, they really depended on natural light and the natural ventilation, just in the way that they were designed. So that's very important aspect of thinking about sustainability in terms of building design.
That's right.
And if I could just add to that, Dr. Mehta is talking about individual buildings, but we can think about neighborhoods as well. Many older neighborhoods were built before we had automobiles. And when we look now to mobility solutions that don't require us to all be in our cars, and we need to look at the historic fabric, even in places like downtown Tampa, downtown St. Pete, you have human scale blocks, you have walkable communities. And so I think preserving some of those helps us in many ways, not just building by building, but also as we construct a city.
Great. Well, listen, we're out of time. I'm so sorry, but thank you both very much for being with us today, Dr. Elizabeth Strom and Dr. Vikas Mehta. Nice to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Well, the discussion continues on our website. Log on to WUSF.org/Florida Matters to express any comments you may have or concerns about the historic preservation effort. Our next story takes us right to the heart of downtown Tampa, where many buildings have come and gone. There are a few gems left remaining, and one in particular that hopes to come back to its former glory. Carson Cooper has the story.
In 1926, the Francis J. Kennard Company started construction in downtown Tampa on the Floridan Hotel. As a boy, Gus Arancibia watched the building go up.
We used to walk down here. A group of us kids stand across that to see it going up. That was something different,
When the hotel was finished, it was the tallest building in all of Florida. Mary Jim Scott knows. Her father managed the hotel, and she grew up at the Floridan. They lived on the top floor.
I found it fun. When I was a child, I pestered the elevators boys to let me run them, and do silly things like that.
The Floridan was a destination itself.
It was beautiful, with all the marble and the crystal chandeliers, and it was, when you walked in, you knew you were in some place special.
It was built with 316 rooms, a mezzanine overlooking an ornate lobby, majestic dining rooms, marble staircases, complete with a nightclub called the Sapphire Room.
Caesar Gunsmart of the Columbia started out playing his violin in the Sapphire Room, and he really packed them in. Oh, everybody came to hear Caesar.
During World War II, servicemen flocked to the Sapphire Room for entertainment.
The GIs nicknamed the Sapphire Room the Surefire Room because you were sure to have a good time.
Gus Arancibia knows all about those days. He was the bartender.
Back in those days, to work behind the bar, you learn so much. People used to call my house to see if I could get them a room. There were 400 rooms in this hotel. And all during those years, you couldn't get a room. It was like this. The place was jumping.
Gus was bartender at the Floridan for almost 20 years, and he loved it. He can still remember some of his favorite customers.
You had your steady customer. Some people came before dinner, before lunch, they had the drink. Mr. Gannon used to come for lunch, and he ordered a double granddad, and then he ordered I'll never forget, it's a ham and sweet rye, and a bottle of Ballantine ale. They don't have that anymore.
In the 60s, as modern motels were built along the new interstate system, the Floridan's business began to decline. In the early 80s, the glory days of the Floridan were gone, and in 1989 it was boarded up. The hotel stood vacant and neglected for more than 15 years. The building had several ownership groups that tried but failed to reopen the hotel. But in 2005, the property was purchased for $6 million by real estate investor Antonius Markopoulos with an eye to reestablish the hotel.
He fell in love with the building because not only did he see its potential, but he loves old buildings, and he couldn't understand why something this valuable and this rich in history would be sitting vacant.
And there's one old bartender who looks forward to that day.
And when I found out that they were going to rebuild it, I want God to let me live. I want to see it when it opens.
For Florida Matters, I'm Carson Cooper.
And now switching gears from downtown Tampa to St. Petersburg, Larry Elliston is here with our next Florida story. So you went to downtown St. Pete to find out how historic preservation is going there.
Yes, I did. You know, when a community has certain memorable characteristics, it has something called a sense of place. Maybe it's the lay of the land, or rich civic heritage, or distinctive architecture, or maybe you can just walk everywhere. Sense of place is something you may not even notice until it's not there anymore. St. Petersburg, the Sunshine City. Still tranquil and historic, but undergoing a change. So when Will Michaels looks through his album of vintage St. Petersburg postcards, he's wistful about the city that was.
We see history, we see art, we see the spirit of our community.
A spirit Will Michaels believes is embodied in the city's buildings. Remarkable old buildings from another Florida, another St. Petersburg that continue to disappear.
This is the Colonial Hotel. It's a great 1920s hotel. It was right in the downtown area. It has recently been demolished, and the Ovation is being built on its site.
As seen across the skyline, new is replacing old. As former head of the St. Petersburg Museum of History and now president of St. Petersburg Preservation, Will Michaels knows a city embracing the future should also covet the past.
We need to keep the historic. We need to keep the personality of the city. We need to keep the charm of the city. That's what gives the city its zip. We're trying to hold on to that, and we're slowly losing it. We need to do everything that we can. We need to redouble our efforts to see that that's not lost as we have new development in our community.
The great success story of historic preservation in St. Petersburg is the magnificent Vinoy Park Hotel. Built during the 1920s, the Vinoy, with its signature Mediterranean revival architecture, is a timeless Florida classic.
The Yankees, Babe Ruth, celebrities, you name it, they've been at this hotel. But in the early 1980s, late 1970s, this hotel was a derelict. It was run down, it was unoccupied. As the result of a number of people who were interested in historic preservation, we were able to find a buyer, we were able to find a developer who came, took an interest in the building, restored it, and turned it into one of the great five-star hotels in the world today.
Without preservationists fighting to save the Vinoy, it might have fallen to the wrecking ball. Ironically, it is this hotel's restoration that paved the way for the large-scale redevelopment that has followed.
Central Avenue, the main street of this modern city, is lined with green benches, a tradition in St. Petersburg.
Once marketed as a relaxing haven where retirees could pass the time in the sunshine, St. Petersburg in more recent decades has gone after a new image and a new look. As entire city blocks give rise to the new St. Petersburg, what troubles preservationists like Will Michaels is the thought of losing even more vintage buildings. At the top of the list, the Detroit Hotel, built in 1888. One vote shy of being protected as a local landmark, the historic Sereno Hotel on Beach Drive met its fate in 1992. All that's left of St. Petersburg's first $1 million hotel is a decorative plaque. You can find it on the side of the building that replaced it. Other than the Vinoy, of course, there's probably no building in St. Petersburg that represents this city's character better than the Snell Arcade at 4th and Central. Built in 1928 by developer Perry Snell, the building is a work of art.
He really put his heart and soul into this building. This was not just business for him. He was someone who enjoyed architecture. He was someone who enjoyed beauty and art, and it brings a sense of personality. It brings a sense of identity. It brings a sense of place to our community here in St. Pete.
As testimony to the building's unique character, the Snell Arcade was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1983. St. Petersburg once had 10 arcades, only 3 survive.
They were built in such a way that you could, you walk through them and they go from like one side of the block to the other. They were cool, they were covered, you were out of the sun, out of the rain if it was raining. It was not only a place to shop, but it was a place to meet your friends and chat and get to know each other better.
It's the quality of life that lives in buildings of a more human scale, buildings like the Snell Arcade or the open-air post office, that Will Michaels hopes will carry into the future. With its beautiful parks and architectural style, St. Petersburg has a feeling that is unique in all of Florida. In blending the new with the old, the challenge is to keep it that way.
Larry, he certainly has a passion for preservation.
Irene, someone mentioned to me that Will Michaels is the heart and soul of St. Petersburg preservation, and I believe it.
I think you're right, too. Thanks a lot, Larry. Thanks for joining us this week. The discussion continues on our website, where you can post comments, ask questions, or contribute story ideas for upcoming episodes. We'll be sure to get back to you. That's it for this week. I'm Irene Mayer. Join us again next time for Florida Matters.
Major funding for Florida Matters comes from the Mosaic Company, a leading producer of fertilizer made from phosphate, a natural resource found in Florida. America's farmers depend on Florida phosphate for their crop nutrition needs. Mosaic, helping America grow.